Hello and welcome to the program. I am Suren. Do you desire to distinguish properly the fact from imagined, truth from fiction? Maybe you, like myself, want to be intrigued with the glimpses into the world of tomorrow, even today, or yesterday. You are then in the right place. Let us consider some intriguing stories. There was no sound coming from the flashing light in the sky. Silence and the speed convinced the observers that it was yet another one of those unidentified flying objects which visited them for many years. One of the watchers directed a laser beam at the light in the sky, and flashes of colored lights on the UFO doubled in frequency. A few moments after, he turned off the laser, and as rapidly as he has turned it off, the light on that flying object resumed its previous stance. They have then ventured to study the luminous phenomena which has been regularly observed since December 1981 in the skies in Norway. And then the UFO took the form of simple balls of light, as usual, appearing from nowhere, and traveled silently up the valley. Sometimes they hovered for a while, then moved on, and always vanishing as mysteriously as they arrived. Hundreds of such lights have been reported in that valley, as all around the world. They used all sorts of equipment, from seismographs to infrared viewers and lasers, and observers bravely kept on watching them in the cold of the northern skies. Near enough to 200 sightings were made during the first month or so, and they have taken hundreds of photographs of those lights in the sky. Now, investigators were certain they were dealing with UFOs. They were known as Hessdalen lights. In some occasions, by individuals, those sightings were confirmed, and also by radar. Whatever creates those lights, definitely floating, flying, maneuvering, and has been completely unidentified by the official sources. When the laser beams were utilized, the response from those lights on occasions were extraordinary. They have had several questions to answer. When they were observed, one of the questions came to mind was, what kind of intelligence was controlling them? Was it Earth-based or alien? Were they perhaps just natural phenomena? Good question. They have then decided to persistently collect as much data as they could about those flying lights. However, most investigators dismissed those lights, as have been only second-hand reports from witnesses whose reliability could not be guaranteed. They have definitely attempted to have direct contact with those lights. And it appeared as if those UFOs were responding to them. The great gardens at Versailles were in their full glory sometime in 1901. It was a hot afternoon. Scent from the plants were very heavy. The colors brilliant. Two English ladies were visiting this magnificent French palace for the very first time. They both felt depressed for some unknown reason as they walked through the grounds. I don't know if you have heard this story, but let me continue. Miss Anne Moberly, who was the principal of St. Hugh's, a women's college of Oxford University, was spending a few days sightseeing in Paris. She was together with Miss Eleanor Jourdain, who was soon to become vice principal of that same college. They were walking through the gardens, and the two ladies decided to find the Petit Trianon, the small private chateau that belonged to the ill-fated Queen Marie Antoinette. As they were involved in a deep conversation together, they noticed that they had lost their way. I began to feel as though I was walking in my sleep. The heavy dreaminess was oppressive, Miss Jourdain later wrote. Miss Moberly felt similarly strange, but each kept their feelings to themselves. They were very surprised to discover only a very few people around at that particular time of the year. They have passed two gentlemen standing near a wheelbarrow, whom they took to be gardeners, despite their long coats and tricorn hats. They have directed the ladies straight ahead. A small bandstand came into view beneath the canopy of trees. A man dressed in a cloak and large hat. He looked like a sinister-looking person and made the women feel ill at ease. They moved on and were later given directions by another man whose appearance seemed strangely very old-fashioned. At the end, through the trees, they could sight of the Petit Trianon, very near. Miss Moberly noticed a woman sketching on the grass. The woman stared at her, much to Miss Moberly's annoyance. Once the ladies were inside the chateau, the depression lifted, and at arrival at a lovely wedding party soon helped them to forget the strange atmosphere they have sensed before. A week afterwards, while Miss Moberly was writing a letter about the visit to Versailles, she experienced the same oppressive sensation once again. And the feeling was so strong that she felt compelled to ask Miss Jourdain if she thought the Petit Trianon was haunted. Jourdain had to admit that she did. For the first time, the women discussed their experiences and became convinced that something rather extraordinary had happened to them. For example, they had walked up to the lady who was sketching alone in the garden, and she had stared at them. Miss Moberly was astonished to discover that Mrs. Jourdain had seen nothing but trees and grass. They decided to investigate and discover a little bit more. On return to England, Miss Moberly discovered that in 1792, on August the 10th, the same date, the two ladies had visited the Versailles. Marie Antoinette and her husband, Louis XVI, were in prison all day in a small room in Paris. Miss Moberly believed it likely humiliated and oppressed. Queen's thoughts might have returned to the last moments of happiness she knew at her chateau in the Versailles shortly before the revolution began. Perhaps the Queen's memory of the time was so vivid, as Miss Moberly put it. Some impress of it was imparted to the palace. Was this perhaps a sort of explanation for their strange experience? When Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain returned to Versailles afterwards, they found that everything had changed. The grounds and buildings they remembered were no longer the same. But the old records and plans of the palace revealed that in 1789, the gardens were as the two women had first seen them. The clothes people had worn, which had struck them as slightly odd and updated for 1901, with the height of fashion in 1789. Miss Moberly's excitement increased when she discovered the portrait of Marie Antoinette. It was the exact image of the sketching lady in the grass near the chateau. Over the years, the two ladies dedicated their vacations to their research, and findings confirmed their belief that they had seen Versailles as it was 112 years before. In 1911, they published their account in a book, which they called An Adventure. The two ladies were so concerned about losing their professional credibility that they felt compelled to publish their account of the story under synonyms. It was only after Miss Jourdain's death in 1924 their true identities were revealed. This book certainly caused the sensation and was considered to be the best authenticated ghost story. There were, as usual, many critics, however, very reluctant to accept these findings. Some of them even thought that they had been hallucinating and just believed that the women had met and spoken to just ordinary people and became confused about the layout of the gardens and made their story fit their romantic notions. However, there was no doubt that the events of that summer afternoon were real enough to Miss Moberly and Mrs. Jourdain. However, the nature of their experience, did they really enter into time of the past and caught up in the traces of Queen's memory, or shared a particularly vivid hallucination, remains a baffling mystery. And here is another story I have been told when visiting friends. It is all about visiting the paradise. 2.5-year-old Durdana Khan had been partially paralyzed for many months, always in pain. One morning during 1968, lying in her cot in the garden of her parents' home in Himalayan foothills, she seemed to give up the struggle. Her mother immediately sent for her husband, who was a doctor, but he found no signs of life. Mrs. Khan carried Durdana into the house, and Dr. Khan made a last attempt to revive his daughter, softly speaking, "Come back, my child, come back." As the last resort, Mrs. Khan poured a few drops of respiratory stimulant into Durdana's mouth. Suddenly, to the amazement of her parents, Durdana opened her eyes and said that the medicine was bitter. After about 15 minutes of clinical death, Durdana had come back to life. The next day, Mrs. Khan asked her daughter what had happened during that quarter hour. Through a series of questions and answers, Mrs. Khan gradually learned that Durdana had been to a garden in the stars, where grew apples, pomegranates, and grapes. There were also 4 streams in the garden: white, blue, green, and brown. There were other people there also. My grandfather, his mother, and another lady who looked like you. Grandpa said he was glad to see me, and his mother took me in her lap. Then I heard Daddy calling me, "Come back, my child, come back." Grandfather said they would have to ask God if she could return to her father. So they went to God, who asked her if she wanted to go back. "I have to," she answered. "My daddy is calling me." "All right," said God, "go." And down, down, down I came from the stars, she said. God had been blue, despite repeating questioning. This was all she could say. Not long after this experience, Durdana went to Karachi, in Pakistan, for an operation. While she was convalescing, she and her mother visited one of Dr. Khan's uncles. As Durdana wondered about the room, she suddenly became very excited, pointing at a photograph on a table. "This is my grandfather's mother," she said. "I met her in the stars." Durdana had never seen her great-grandmother or her photograph before. Only two pictures existed, and both were in her great-uncle's house in Karachi, which Durdana was visiting for the very first time in her life that day. Later, Durdana's family moved to London, and in the early 1980s appeared on British television with pictures she had painted of the garden she had visited in the stars. The next day, one of the Dr. Khan's patients, Rachel Goldsmith, telephoned him about the program. She had had a similar experience of death while in a German concentration camp. She had been to a garden with 4 streams and had been to the spot illustrated in one of Durdana's paintings. When she and Durdana met and talked about what had happened to them, Mrs. Goldsmith could even describe details that Durdana remembered, but had left out of the painting. What is one to make of Durdana's experience, would you say? She has herself admitted that apples, pomegranates, and pears are mentioned in the Holy Quran, as are 4 streams in paradise or Jannah. But Durdana was not raised as a Muslim at that time and had never attended a mosque. Dr. Khan suggested that perhaps the reason God appeared to be blue and formless, in that the closest we on earth come to a vision of God's infinity is the infinite blue of the sky. On Mars, the sky is red, said Durdana. So, to a Martian, maybe God would appear to be red. Durdana's recognition of the picture of her great-grandmother and Mrs. Goldsmith's recognition of the garden suggests that more than imagination was at work in the quarter hour that Durdana was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Here is yet another story of intrigue and unbelievable capacity. Michael Sedgwick was a research director of the Montague Motor Museum at Beaulieu Abbey in England, and had been working on small hours. One night before Christmas in 1959, his office was thick with tobacco smoke. He opened the windows to clear the air, and he heard a chant of a Catholic mass. It came in uneven waves, as if from a faulty wireless, he said. It was so beautiful that I tried to find it on my own wireless, and I couldn't. During that same evening, Bertha Day, the Abbey's catering manager, also heard the singing. I knew that Mrs. Mears, a local lady, had died, she said. Later, both Sedgwick and Mrs. Day realized that they had heard the monks of Beaulieu Abbey singing a mass, their custom, when one of the inhabitants of the nearby village had died. But no monks had lived in the abbey since 1538. Founded by Cistercian monks in 1204, the abbey flourished until Henry VIII dissolved it. But the monks, it would seem, had really never left. To the local people, the ghosts of Beaulieu are just another part of life in the village. One vicar, Reverend Robert Fraser Powles, was on such good terms with the ghosts that he knew several by name. At Christmas, he would hold services for them in the village church. A parishioner at one Sunday service remarked on how small the congregation had been that day. Replied vicar, "It's bigger than you can see." Not everyone has accepted the Beaulieu's ghosts so readily. One member of a film crew working at the Abbey heard someone following him down a flight of stairs. When the footsteps overtook him, he was terrified. Whoever was there was invisible. Other people have been unnerved by noises at night that appear to come from the former graveyard of the monks. The sounds have been likened to those over burial taking place. The monks have also been seen as well as heard. They are always dressed in brown, the garb of the brothers of the Abbey, who, unlike the white-robed choir monks, did not take holy orders. Margaret Rutherford, the English actress, once saw a brown-clad monk reading in the ruined cloister, as did a member of the Abbey staff in 1965. During World War II, officers from a nearby anti-aircraft unit saw a group of monks near the church. In 1979, a monk was seen pruning the vines in the newly revived Abbey vineyard. Lord Montague, whose family has owned the Abbey since 1673, claims that the ghosts have never been anything but friendly. Seeing their beloved Abbey still so well tended after so many centuries, perhaps the monks feel they have no reason to be anything else. I would like to tell you some of my personal experiences now, which I have been keeping hidden from the public face. The reason being my desire of not being ridiculed and laughed at. But now, in my ripe, mature age, I don't see any reason to hide it any longer, although some critics would prefer to laugh at me, still considering me as a mature-aged person probably losing his mind. But that is never the case, nor it has ever been so, although there was a time in my younger days that my ex-wife, whom I have written about in my reasonably well-publicized and documenting autobiography in fantasy style, which has been published in 2 parts. And although the first part is being published, but the second part is not yet being made available for the unusual treatments of my publisher for making money being more important than publishing anyone's works. That is, of course, a different matter, so I will not talk about it in this particular program. But go to my childhood days for a moment or two. First, to tell you my very first experiences, and then I will tell you a little bit more about my further experiences. My very first experience that I can recall quite vividly happened when I was very young and at the primary school. As some considered that I probably had vivid imagination, even then, as I do now. However, my imagination has been taken as if it was only a child's developing mind. But I had a memory of past times, indeed past lives. For instance, I would dream almost every night when I slept that I was in a spacefaring craft. I remember quite vividly my travels amongst the stars, visiting different landscapes, star clusters, and other worlds, and remembering them all on my waking hours. I would try to make comparisons with the Earth-based sites, but having no choice other than accept where I was at or was born into. I considered myself as being a very rebellious child at the time, not in a destructive sense, but in a very adventurous sense. I have been told as a child not to go to the potholes on the roadside near where I lived with my parents, and put my arms or hands into those potholes on roadside where hardly any traffic of horse carriages and rarely any cars then were to be seen. I could understand their concerns because roads can be dangerous for the young children. Besides, people used to talk that certain children were disappearing around those potholes. But my curiosity took the best of me, as I observed incandescent purple lights coming from one of those potholes. After returning home, after school, I wanted to see if there were people working inside, under the ground. Those lights were flashing rather slowly, on and off, but they were mostly purple-colored, and I could not even describe properly because I had not developed the language skills to do so. We have been advised not to go there without an adult supervision. But the adults I have known at the time, including my parents or my cousins, would only laugh at my childish nonsense. And so I took the matters into my own hands alone. One day, coming back from school, I noticed those lights again, and was putting a little stick inside one of those holes where the lights flashed. I became aware of two huge black eyes looking at me, with the sound of a pleasant voice within my own head, saying, "Don't be afraid, little boy. We are your friends. We are not going to do any harm. please, if you desire to come in, we can talk and show you some things of the mechanical kind that we are using. Then you can go home. I did not understand what they were going to show me, or what mechanical kind of things was meant to be. I was not afraid of them, and they were so friendly, creating the impression that they were friends truly, not there to harm me or anybody. And so I extended my arms both into the hole in the ground, and I was suddenly inside. I have written about this particular account in short, few sentences in my autobiography. And now, here it goes again. I was inside a round chamber with lots of equipment and screens, which showed outside and also inside this strange environment, as well as those which showed very unusual emblems and signs, and those others showing the stars, all in perfect color and dimensions. I was listening, and they were telling me in my head as they spoke, and I didn't see their mouths move. But I knew what they were talking to me about. And everything that I thought, they responded in my head without moving their lips. But their eyes and their movements were in response to what I was talking about, or asking things, and understanding. They explained that those things were going to be made available a while later, in my younger days as well as in my older days. But the second choice was not to my liking. That is, my older days, because I did not want to be old, because I have seen how old people looked, behaved, and lived. I tried to absorb everything they showed me, and when the time was of no importance at the time, even for me at that stage, whether it was nighttime or daytime did not make any difference. But the experience was as physically real. No, I was not imagining, I was not dreaming, I was not asleep. I was fully awake and aware. Explaining thoroughly, they showed me and told me things. They explained even then that we were here on this world as a guest, learning and teaching, that it was our assignment. Funnily enough, even at that age, I seemed to understand what is being said. I seemed to follow them word by word, thought by thought, exactly as it was all meant to be. They spoke to me, and as if they were trying to remind me of what I was working on before coming to this world. They showed me the solar systems, planets, satellites, and all sorts of other things that an astronomer would be mostly interested. I was not an astronaut, not a scientist. I was only a little school kid. However, on the other side, which normal everyday people around me could not see or understand, I was very much like an adult, able to think and formulate my words properly in that state. Then finally came a time when I found myself outside that hall, on the ground, and I heard my new friends' voices in my head. We will meet you again, and soon enough. Did they really mean to meet me again? I cannot say, but I had some very interesting dreams ever since. Maybe, just maybe, I was doing what has been discovered much later in my younger days. Astral traveling. Was it all in my mind? Was it all a dream? Was it all real? I ask these questions again and again and again. Then came a time when I was a little better educated and knowing a few things, having completed my high school level and won a place at one of the universities to study history of the world and geography. But I did not realize that it was my choice. It was not. My circumstances of the personal kind forced me to move out from that country where my parents dwelt into another country. I wanted to educate myself elsewhere and started making plans on my own superconscious level. Even then, I was not going to change anything, and that I had an invisible childhood friend. Although this friend was invisible for the outsiders, for the world, to me, very much visible. Considering he told me that he was going to be with me and guide me. Much later, I learned, of course, about this friend, similar to other people's ignored friends throughout their lives. That we all had a guardian, if you like. You may call this guardian as a guardian angel, as in some circles they have been known as such. He, with his usual deep and resonant voice, told me that this decision of mine, wanting to go out into another country to be educated, was the correct one, and he was going to help me all the way. I was living now in a part of Germany, sharing a room at the dwelling of a German couple belonging to a certain cult. Although it was not my interest, eventually I was introduced to a girl whom I felt in love with, and eventually ended up in marrying her. Regrettably, however, she belonged to that particular cult after getting baptized to that faith and imposed many restrictions upon my existence. Now, unable to compose or play my piano, I did not do anything else, including watching television or listening to news, other than just reading the Bible and praising the good Lord. During my studies, I also had a part-time job as a library technician at an American military facility in Germany. After one Christmas occasion, in which I had been offered some drinks I was not familiar with, and going home afterwards in the fast train, or Schnellzug, I had an out-of-the-body experience where I found myself dreaming, if you like, but more correctly, floating above the train under me. I was seeing like a bird on flight the townships, the people, cathedrals, gardens, all the new buildings and the old, and the train stations, and on one stage the train stopped at a station, and an ambulance was called upon, and a man from the compartment I was in being taken into it. But I was still floating above the train and seeing it all. I felt somehow disturbed about the poor man's situation, that he had to be taken to the ambulance and to a hospital. That concern of mine took me right into the ambulance in my so-called dream state, as I considered it to be. Then I came face to face with my own image, as if looking into a mirror. But this image was a complete replica of me without being, just a mirror image. Because I was not looking at the image as partially as we do know as seen in a mirror, but a complete person, when everything looked like my own image, except his eyes were closed. I wanted to spend more time and wanted to see the image of me, to move, to come alive. And I heard my guardian angel's resonant voice saying, "This is you, my beloved, but you cannot go there anymore. No longer you can go in there for a while. You must leave this area now and drift into a tunnel of multicolored texture, which I cannot describe fully. I met other people in other places, indeed a world that reminded me of a beautiful garden with the marvelous fruits, all kinds of birds singing in the air, so fresh, so beautiful, but I could not see the sun, although this environment was so brilliantly light, like a brilliant daytime, and the colors so magnificent, so incredible. I felt that I was lost. Then I heard people's voices, worrying if they were friendly or not. I met some who claimed to be my past relatives, explaining many things, and I took in everything they said. And then came a time, but I have been taken to places of complete antiquity, having shown the histories of a world and new inventions of humanity. I still wondered why I had this privilege to be shown all these wonderful things. There were a lot of information to be shared. I have been ushered to libraries of such magnificence that I cannot describe the vastness and beauty, but I have discovered many records of other worlds, particularly the planet Earth, on three-dimensional screens. Everything was like a science fiction in appearance. But was it? Then I found myself having a visit to some people who called themselves as my relatives. When I asked them that I should go home now, because my wife was waiting in a place called Kirchheim Tech in Germany, a small city near Stuttgart. When I heard my beloved guardian telling me, in his usual resonant voice, it was not the time yet. When my body was ready, I would be returned. Eventually came that time when I woke up in a mortuary where my body was prepared for burial. But I woke up, as I have been told, I was going to and the girl carrying a tray of unusual materials dropped it. Dropped everything in shock as I asked her for a glass of water. This part was no longer my astral environment, which was surreal. That appeared and felt very physical, but the reality in the sense. They conducted tests and my partner, my beloved wife, but was contacted. However, she was no longer interested. No longer it was Christmas, and she didn't believe in it. And I could not speak of this to anybody, for it was very unusual. My wife then informed me in the hospital that this was what could happen and did happen to people who were rebellious in their hearts and did not accept the truth properly and shared the pagan Christmas festivities. I could not believe what I was hearing. My experience did not end there. I have experienced more UFO-related issues, especially on the way to Australia, when I was traveling on a big passenger ship. When I have experienced and documented on film, which I was carrying with me, as it was my hobby. Even though much later I have shown the film to others, they considered that I was only dreaming. I have wondered about this ever since. Did I take pictures of my dreams? And if that was so, it would be marvelous. Indeed, perhaps I had the most recent technology provided to me in the film cameras, which could take the pictures of my dreams. Of course, it was not possible. And I did not speak about this to anybody ever since. Then when I settled with my wife and our first child in Hobart in Tasmania, after coming home from a prayer session one evening with her friends living there late night, we have experienced the most brilliant lights coming from outside into our room through the shattered windows. When I ventured out to discover what it was, my wife grabbed me on my shoulder, demanding not to go out, but we have been encouraged by 3 tall, beautiful, very friendly looking people who invited us into their craft, first approaching us, then my wife, and I entering into the craft is so clearly etched in my mind. I cannot forget. Inside was a different world altogether, and a group of people in a rounded, big hall with other people, monitors of spherical crystalline structures floating above a control mechanism, and all around, showing our front door, our dwelling, and other parts of the suburb we were living in. One beautiful voice told me in my head, "Here we are, Suren. As promised, we are meeting again." Indeed, during which time we were encouraged to leave our sleeping child home. She was going to be looked after and was going to be all right. That was not an easy task, to leave a sleeping child alone and going out for a trip in a spacefaring craft with one's wife who didn't believe these things. Unless they were demons creating these kinds of imagery in front of our very eyes, according to the cultist dictums she was subjected to. We have had a trip into space-faring craft. It was all shown in the windows, or monitors if you like. We have seen the whole city of Hobart, the whole appearance of the island of Tasmania, and the whole continent of Australia. And we were distancing fast over the curvature of the beautiful blue planet, Earth. It was in our view. Awe-inspiring. We could feel that there was a slight movement, but it was very pleasant. They took us to places, I would say, unimaginable for an average person, even a scientist. We have seen the moon at a close proximity. We have seen some unusual structures about the moon, which I will not include here. This portion of the program, we have shown different planetary systems of our solar system, the magnificent suns in the distance, all the stars of the galactic space, stretching in front of us in its full glory of vast distances. And how beautiful, how wonderful everything was. We were made to feel very much loved and cared for. Yet for my wife, for a very strange change, was very calm, absorbing it all. Maybe it was that weird experience, or the feeling was induced without any side effects, as we have been later told. That we have been explained all sorts of things, which looked so familiar, as whatever was said was made available visually in front of our eyes and within our own minds. I wondered how my wife would take it all. Eventually came the time and we were returned back, the same way we have moved out from the craft, making me wonder if this journey has been noticed by others on the street or the neighborhood. We were yet to discover that. After farewelling our dear friends, and they took off into the skies and disappearing, we entered our dwelling, my wife wanting to sit on the soft cushioned chair, fell immediately into a deep sleep. I checked the child. She was sound asleep and happy, and I prepared some tea, offering to my wife, thinking that she was still awake. She opened her eyes and was having a very bad nightmare, she said, that I should get rid of my spiritual books, which were actually the books on psychology and those about astronomy, those that I have borrowed from the library. She was demanding that I should get rid of them by burning them in front of her, because they were having a bad influence on us, she said, and she was having nightmares. And I asked her what kind of nightmares she had. She explained exactly the whole scenario and whole history as it was enacted in our unusual and shared trip with our friends from elsewhere. For her, it remained a nightmare, a dream, and not real. It did not remain there, as I had many more such unusual experiences. As I said, I have not spoken or told about this because of the implications or what others would consider. There are more stories that I can tell, but I shall leave that for next opportune time. However, it has not been forgotten that there are so many experiences that we have, everyone has, and we ignored them as dreams and nightmares. Are we following the right path by ourselves? What do we know about ourselves really? Of course, in the late 80s, I happened to be living in West Australia in Perth, where I had a small studio while doing some visualization and imagined work upon the floor plans of architects in my studio after hours, where shops were completely closed late at night. I heard a beautiful voice of a young boy. I was not only spellbound, but totally worried about a child being lost, or somehow sneaked in before the doors were closed. I attempted to call the police for some assistance, during which the child made an appearance and asking me in his flute-like voice, "Art thou the artist?" In shock, with my hair standing on end, I asked him, when did he come in, and was he hiding in the back, or where his parents were? And said unto him, "I am an artist, yes." And he said, "Oh, that's fine, very fine. Good night." I thought that I'm hearing voices and seeing things which did not exist when he disappeared into the furniture. It was very late at night, and so I decided to close the doors and go home to my unit. Next day, I was intending to work on the project I have taken from an architect, working on his floor plan. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and settled doing my work. Closer to 12 midnight, I heard the young lad's voice again, asking me, "Art thou the artist?" I answered hesitantly and said, "Yes, I was. But how does he make himself appear and disappear?" I wondered, while he asked me, "Art thou Michelangelo, sire?" I said, "No, I am Suren." He responded with, "Oh, that is good." I had no goodbyes this time, nothing, and he played his little trick again. He disappeared into the furniture. This time, I thought that the situation was a little too weird, worrying about my own mental health. Understandably, contacted another friend of mine of the same background who lived in Sydney and told him about what I was experiencing. And he advised me to have a break, to have a holiday, probably in Sydney, probably at his place. I thought deep about this issue that it would be probably the best thing to do on my part, as I also was very tired. However, I was going to finish the project I started, but before doing so, next day in my studio, I stayed a little longer in order to finish the project I was working on. This time, I was not really expecting the young lad to make an appearance, but he did. However, he had also an elderly gentleman with a hood and a heavy overcoat, perhaps a cloak. Same questions streamed out of this lad's mouth, asking me if I was the artist. He also asked me if I could draw his image this time round. Canst thou draw mine image this time, sire? And I advised him, saying, if you keep on disappearing, I cannot. But if you stay there, then I can try. He looked at the elderly gentleman, and both seemed to be in agreement. And he said, okay. So I started using one of my large sheets of paper, utilizing very soft pencils, and started drawing his beautiful eyes, then the rest of the face. When I finished it, it appeared that he was talking to me with his eyes. It seemed that I have promised to do this, and who knows when. And this time I had fulfilled my promise. But that is what I have been guessing. The work took me about 5 hours to finish, and whilst I was putting the finishing touches and spraying it with a protective coating, I asked him mentally that he was probably a projection from out of my mind. And he answered me back, saying, no, it was not so. I volunteered to be here. They disappeared into the furniture, never to be seen again. I have kept his portrait for all those years as a treasured work of art. It is not for sale. However, whenever I look into his portrait, I always seem to hear his voice telling me, do not worry about anything, because nothing is worth worrying. Many people seeing his portrait said that he spoke to them mentally, and perhaps, as some people said, worryingly. But I don't see any worry in his face, but telling me, just be happy. With this, I shall finish this episode. Thank you very much for watching. Keep smiling and be happy until we meet again. Thank you.